welcome to this third session. So today we'll be thinking about Helen of Troy. So we've been tracing the ghosts and the phantoms of Homer's Trojan War, and so far we've looked at the ghosts of the Homeric underworld, including the ghost of Homer himself, and we've looked at the reanimated cult hero Protesilaus, 15 feet tall and desperate to set the historical record straight about what really happened at Troy. And today we're going to turn to a figure who is synonymous with the Trojan conflict. So that's Helen of Sparta, or Helen of Troy, and of course the duality of her name signals that sort of fundamental sense of ambivalence and the kind of doubling that haunts this figure in the tradition of thinking about the Trojan War. And I'm interested in Helen partly because she becomes a catalyst for a whole series of debates about agency, blame and responsibility as a figure who started the Trojan War, or who in many accounts started it. We'll come to that in a minute. And really who represents a sense of the relationship between individual responsibility and the wider forces that motivate people or force people to act as they do, whether that's the gods or fate and so on. So Helen, I'm going to argue, becomes a catalyst for thinking about this question of the relationship between humans and the gods, the role of women in particular, women's agency, and the question of modes of persuasion, which became increasingly the focus of debate in the ancient world. So we've had kind of glimpses of Helen already, and I want to draw out three sort of trends or ways of engaging with the tradition of Helen and her sense of agency or responsibility in antiquity. The first is blaming Helen, or debating about the degree to which Helen is responsible for the actions she was held to have caused. The second is traditions thinking about Helen's absence and that kind of relationship between her absence or presence. And the third is kind of reassessing or rewriting or reconceiving of Helen's motives. Now, Helen has come up already in some of our travels. We were thinking particularly in the first week about representations of ghosts and so on in the underworld, and as well as seeing Lucian's account in the True Histories of the Isles of the Blessed, where Helen is repeatedly kidnapped. So Helen being doomed to replay the same sorts of narratives again and again and again. And of course that's typical of Helen in the wider mythical tradition as well. So Helen was held to have been abducted by Theseus even as a teenager before she was abducted by Paris. She gets married again and again and again. You know, marriage is a loose term in these sorts of contexts. Can also encompass sort of sexual liaison as well as marriage in a sort of strict sense. But beyond sort of her first encounter with Theseus, then Menelaus, Paris after Paris's death, Deiphobos, etc. So she's sort of the one who was always being married, and Lucian's sort of playing with that in his image of her in the underworld and these sort of histories on loop. And we saw too that she was in the underworld the subject of lawsuits. So one of the kings of the dead in the underworld was adjudicating which, after all, is her rightful wife. Is it Theseus? Is it Menelaus? And that too draws on ancient traditions of debating about Helen and sort of different ways of interpreting her behaviour or her life. But we've also seen in the Dialogues of the Dead, Lucian play with the idea of Helen as the most coveted, the most beautiful woman in the world, and the face that launched as many ships as she did. And this is in the Dialogues of the Dead. So in the first week we saw about this as sort of a radical idea of a democratic underworld where everybody is the same and no person is more beautiful than the others. Now I want to turn today to another of his dialogues. And this is one in which Protesilaus, our hero from last week, the first Greek to die as part of the Trojan campaign, so on Asian soil, emerges as absolutely furious still with Helen. So Euripides, who's one of the judges in the underworld, sort of tries to understand and tries to restrain him. So, you know, why are you trying to attack Helen? What is going on here, Protesilaus? Protesilaus says, I'm really angry with Helen because she's the reason I was killed. I left my house half built and my newlywed wife a widow. Now this picks up on two Homeric tropes or kind of associations. The first is the description of Protesilaus in the Iliad. We glimpsed that briefly last week. So the only time he's really mentioned, the few lines devoted to Protesilaus, he talks about him commanding the soldiers of Thessaly, but his wife had been left behind and his house was half built. But a Trojan man killed him. So he's sort of expanding on that sort of Homeric portrait of him. So he's saying that Helen is the reason that his house is half built and his wife is a widow. But he's also picking up on another Homeric image, which is the idea of Odysseus in the underworld meeting a whole series of heroes, including Ajax. And Ajax, we hear, just is eternally angry. So he's angry for the victory. This is Odysseus recounting his experiences in the underworld, that Ajax is still full of wrath for the victory that Odysseus won over him in the contest for the arms of Achilles. So Ajax feels slighted, and this we hear is an anger that endures in eternity. So Ajax, he says, won't you forget your wrath even in death? And Ajax refuses to, again, there's a sort of degree of petulance perhaps from Ajax here in the underworld, and there's a kind of an interest in the Homeric epics in exploring this sort of other side of heroes where pride or sense of exalted social status shades into petulance effectively. But Ajax is so cross that Odysseus has bested him that he won't engage in conversation with him. The text leaves it a little bit uncertain as to whether if they'd carried on conversation, Odysseus could have won him over. It says maybe they could have done, but actually Odysseus just wanted to meet all the other ghosts. He didn't have time to stand around sort of appeasing Ajax's wounded feelings about his status in the underworld. He's got a mission and he's got other people to meet. So the difference here is that Odysseus is alive. He's down in the underworld, but it's a temporary state. His time is precious. He needs to move on. He needs to press on. Lucian gives us a world where these figures have all the time in the world to explore these issues, to see if they can sort of change their minds and to think about this question of responsibility and their relationship between their life after death and their life above the ground. So the question particularly of why they all died and how they were regarded at the point of their death. So Euripides then says, well, why are you attacking Helen? Well, it's because he was killed on behalf of Helen because of being on the Trojan campaign. Well, actually, says Euripides, well, maybe you shouldn't be blaming Helen. Maybe it's Menelaus, because he's the one that got you to go to war. So he summoned, Protesilaus, we hear in the Catalogue of Women, was one of the suitors of Helen. So he'd agreed. So he was sort of duty bound by that sense. But it was Menelaus who made them go to war. So Protesilaus says, OK, fine, fair enough. Actually, it's Menelaus who's to blame. Up pops Menelaus and says, no, you've got this all wrong. It's not my fault, it's Paris's fault. He was a guest in my house, but he carried off Helen, and that's entirely wrong. That contravenes all the practices of hospitality in Greece. So Paris ought to be killed, not just by you, but by everybody. Raises the question here about, Paris's degree of responsibility, the fact that Paris alone committed this injustice, but it's all the Trojans who suffer. Something that's raised in the Iliad with that sort of spectre of single combat that would have sorted everything out effectively, but never quite happens. So Protesilaus says, OK, fine, Paris. All right, we've got rid of Helen, we've got rid of Menelaus as prospects, it's Paris who's responsible. Paris pops up and says, no, I'm just your typical lover. It's not my fault, it's a divine power that leads us wherever it chooses. You cannot resist Eros. So Protesilaus says, well, I wish I could catch and punish Eros. Euripides says, well, Eros is going to say that maybe he caused Paris's desire, but it's your fault, Protesilaus, because you you were in love, you had an Eros, a sort of desire for glory. So it's you who decided to do this, and you're the one who wanted to kind of leap out first and be remembered forevermore. Protesilaus says, well, no, I can't be held responsible. It's not me, it's fate. It was all simply predestined. And Aeacus says, fine, we've sorted it out. Nobody is to blame. After this sort of lengthy discussion, we have all these possible candidates, but I think the best solution is that we don't blame anybody. So we have here kind of Lucian in a very brief compass exploring these questions of responsibility. The underworld is a place of judgment. It's a place of sort of assessing over all these questions of cause and responsibility. But Lucian's also kind of drawing on quite a long tradition of reassessing this question. And I think that the issue of Helen's responsibility for causing the Trojan War is one that was continually being assessed in antiquity. And that's, I think, why Lucian's picking up on this as ripe for this. So it's reassessed constantly, even during Helen's own life, during the 10 years at Troy. She herself is constantly pondering it. We see her in the Iliad again and again, reflecting on this question of her own culpability. And forever after, in the ancient tradition, it sort of reverberates through the tradition. But there isn't really any consensus on this. And Helen herself blames herself, uses quite aggressive language towards herself actually, and says, I wish I'd never, I wish I weren't alive, I wish this had all never happened, calls herself sort of dog-like and dog-faced, which is less a sense of our sort of English sort of idea of threats and so on. It's more about shamelessness. So in the antiquity, dogs were very much associated with that question of shamelessness and not being able to resist one's sort of emotional urges and impulses and things like that. But she blames herself, which is quite interesting because other people are blaming Paris primarily in the Iliad. So her blaming of herself kind of brings forward the sense that she is responsible, but she also had a choice, that she has a sense of agency. The Trojans assess her as well. So this is in Iliad 3 when she's on the wall, looking out, talking to Priam and to the Trojan elders. And the Trojans speak to one another. There's a sense of constantly being talked about, and Helen herself is very conscious of that. She refers to that as well. So the Trojans say, well, actually, she's so beautiful that can fully understand why the Greeks and the Trojans are fighting over her, but just let her go. Just let her not stay here and ruin our lives. Priam is much gentler towards her and says, come here, you're actually, in my eyes, you're not to blame. It's the gods, I think, who are to blame, the gods who roused the tearful war of the Achaeans. And I think there's a tendency amongst translators often to say, the gods are to blame. Actually, what Priam says there is, he says, moi. So to me, as far as I'm concerned, in my view, it's the gods who are to blame and it's not you. And that's, I think, really important. We never get a sense that in the Iliad and the Odyssey, this part of the epic worldview, the gods can very often cause things, but that doesn't exculpate human beings. So there's a sort of a sense of double determination, as it's known. So the god can put something in somebody's mind or make them do something, but they are also responsible. Just as having the god help you doesn't mean that you don't get glory from it. So the one doesn't preclude the other. And that's quite important. So Priam is excusing her here, but he's very clear that this is really his perspective. So divine agency doesn't lessen kind of personal responsibility. Priam's the only one who suggests to Helen that it might do. And we'll come back to that in a moment, that question of the gods and the degree to which the gods, so in this case, the idea that Aphrodite has controlled the action, has caused Paris to run off with Helen, what that does for that sense of the responsibility that Helen and Paris themselves take on. Now, I think this is a really important passage, and it's one that was hugely productive for later thinkers, partly the sense that Helen is being assessed by those around her. that the Trojans are not simply sort of passively, just defending their city against the Greeks without thinking about that wider issue, but they are constantly assessing why it is that they have got to this position. Now, of course, this bothered ancient commentators that this only comes so late in the Trojan War. Why haven't they done this right from the outset? Why does Priam need her to tell him who it is who's on the battlefield when he's been watching them for years? But nevertheless, it's important that it's been included at this point as an explicit reflection on the question of Helen's responsibility. Immediately after this, Helen then kind of famously interacts with both Aphrodite and Paris. Aphrodite tries to force her to sleep with Paris. Helen tries to resist, but in the end is won over by Aphrodite. But importantly there, as part of that interaction, she says, I don't want to sleep with Paris, mainly because the Trojan women will hate me. So she is very conscious not only of that original moment, the sort of her decision to come with Paris to Troy, and it is largely represented in the Iliad as a decision. It wasn't a forcible abduction. There's no sense in Homer that it was necessarily. But that she is constantly being evaluated for her behaviour and judged by those around her. So my next text that thinks about these issues in the ancient world is really a full tragedy-length exploration of this question, of the idea, the image of Helen constantly being judged by the Trojans around her, and particularly her suggestion that the Trojan women hate her with a visceral passion. So this is a play that picks up both on that idea of Helen and in her context surrounded by Trojans, that she is a Greek who is sort of brought in, semi-assimilated to the Trojan community. And it also picks up on the way in which the Iliad ends with the Trojan women, so Hector's wife Andromache, Hector's mother Hecuba, and Helen herself lamenting for Hector. So this is a play, a 5th century play by Euripides that is all about lamentation. So it takes as its focus the question really of what women can do in warfare. What the possibilities are for them to take control of their own lives, to change anything, or really, in the absence of the ability to change things, to kind of renegotiate their own understanding of it, their own narrative explanations for the events that are surrounding them and are kind of dictating their lives. So this is a play that was produced in 415, so at a kind of a moment in the Peloponnesian War, the war between effectively Athens and Sparta and their allies, that was becoming increasingly intense and brutal. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So the play represents the very end of the Trojan War. So Troy is in flames, it's sort of smouldering. Right from the start of the play, the gods come on stage and we hear that Troy is being burned. The Trojan women are enslaved, and almost all the characters in the play are women, apart from some of the Greek warriors and heralds who interact with them. Hecuba is the main character, the widow, the queen, the former queen of Troy, and part of the tragedy is about the idea of this woman who formerly was royal, was revered, had a huge number of children, which in antiquity was thought to be an unadulterated good thing for the most part, but all of those have been lost. So she's lost her husband, her children, her homeland. All of these women are being enslaved and are about to be taken away as war captives by the Greeks in a form of, for the most part, sexual enslavement. Andromache is also powerless as the Greeks kill her baby Astyanax. And there's a question here about this idea of agency, of what women can do, and of the impact of warfare on women, something that's raised in the Iliad, of course. And there's a famous scene where Hector and Andromache interact in the middle of the war, and little baby Astyanax is terrified of his father's helmet. And so his father has to sort of choose, as it were, in that moment between the family and his mode as a warrior. So there's a tension that's explored in this play and more widely about the drive for glory on the one hand and the ability to keep a family together, to preserve life, to think about a moment beyond that moment of glory. And we saw that a little bit with Odysseus's conversation with Achilles in the underworld, where Achilles had sort of purportedly changed his mind that the best form of life is a sort of short, sharp burst of glory and an early death. He said, actually now I'd rather be unknown but live into old age, or at least middle age, at home with my family. So in comparison to a lot of tragedies, not much happens. So it's been accused of a play that really is all about lamentation. So this is about the kind of bewailing but the inability to change anything. At the end, Astyanax, Hector and Andromache's baby, is killed, but beyond that it's really about trying to make sense of war and its impact. And this, of course, is in part a commentary on contemporary war, and there's a kind of an interest in that all the way through. But it's also a commentary on Helen's relationship with Menelaus and the differentiation of these futures that lie in store for the women. And we'll have a look in a moment at the reunion between Helen and Menelaus. Now, this is a play that has been enormously popular, probably one of the most popular plays for performance, tragedies for performance over the last century or so, precisely because it does provide a commentary on warfare and on contemporary politics. And in antiquity, of course, tragedy was a key way of offering an oblique commentary on contemporary society. So events that were too raw and too recent for direct comment. Various different models, of course, had been proposed in antiquity. We know of one playwright, Phrynichus, earlier in the 5th century. He'd composed a play about very recent events, so the Persian sack of Miletus. But we hear that the Athenians burst into tears on watching it and were furious, and the playwright was fined a huge amount of money, fined 1,000 drachmas, and forbidden ever from producing that play again. So you can't have tragedy on contemporary events, it said. It's too recent, it's too raw. So in that sense, the Trojan War becomes a proxy for thinking about other wars, whether that's the Persian War, the Peloponnesian War, or various other conflicts, including conflicts right up to the 20th and 21st century. And that's partly why I think this play has been so popular, is that this was always a way of providing a bleak commentary on social mores and on warfare itself. So the moment that I'm particularly interested in comes in the third episode, the agon, logon, or the kind of the debate that comes, and that is where Menelaus has come to retrieve Helen and take her home. But Helen says, "Well, you know, how have you come to this decision?" So she's going to be killed. The decision is Menelaus's decision that she will be punished for her actions, for running off with Paris and for causing the Trojan War. And she demands, effectively, a right to defend herself. Am I permitted to argue against this decision, to say that it would be unjust to kill me? Menelaus says, well, you know, I'm not really here for arguments, I'm here for action, I'm here to kill you. He's here as a warrior. Hecuba, interestingly, wants the closure that comes from a sort of a form of public prosecution, the ability to really make Helen come to terms with, or at least face up to, what she's done. And Hecuba has been furious all the way through the play. And in fact, all of the Trojan women are constantly attacking Helen. They have a deep-seated resentment towards her as the cause of all of their current misfortunes. Andromache says, well, I've spent all my time being the perfect wife. Why is it that other people can, come in and do as they please, irrespective of the consequences? And Hecuba holds her personally responsible for all of the losses that she's suffered. Menelaus says, well, it'll take, quite a lot of time to do this, but fine, I'll do it for you, Hecuba, to you, but not for Helen, but if that's what you want, then fine, we'll set this up. Helen says, well, maybe it's not going to make a difference if I argue well or badly, you're just going to kill me anyway. And she says, well, fine, never mind, I'll still answer the accusations I think you're going to make against me. So this is an extraordinary moment. So this is, we're dealing with the sack of Troy, the aftermath of the sack of Troy. Troy is literally burning behind these characters. Menelaus is furious with his wife for running off, for causing him this sort of shame and disgrace. He orders her to be sort of dragged. It's sort of lovely image. He says, drag her by her murderous hair. The idea that she combines this sort of sense of the beauty and the appeal of her hair, but this is something that has a kind of a tangible violence to it. And in the midst of this, they stop and have a formalised debate over whether Helen was indeed responsible for these actions. And of course, this is, it's not a coincidence that we're dealing here with 5th century Athens, that this is a product of a society in which words and rhetoric were absolutely vital. So a space in which all kinds of crucial decisions, political decisions, military decisions, as well as legal decisions were taken through argument and public debate. And a city where rhetorical techniques of persuasion were being developed and honed. But I think it's particularly interesting that Helen is represented here as having a persuasive voice of her own. So very often elsewhere, and in things like, so we have a defence or a praise of Helen by the sophist Gorgias, so a kind of a paradoxical, rhetorical defence of Helen, but she's again stripped of her voice. She's being spoken for, but she doesn't get to speak for herself. Here she takes on all the kind of persuasive armoury that was being developed in the 5th century through these sort of techniques of rhetoric and oratory, and uses them, marshals them for her own defence. And there's a way in which she's sort of revelling in the entertainment value, much in the way that Gorgias, the sophist who defends Helen, is doing as well. So Helen says she's not to blame, Hecuba's to blame. Hecuba's the one who gave birth to Paris. So it's a punchy opening when she's debating with Hecuba. But it kind of raises questions, particularly about a kind of mythical tradition where things are preordained, where there's a question of things like inherited guilt, where things that have happened several generations back in a family can come to haunt people, and of course where there are oracles and prophecies, and there's a tendency for people, particularly loving parents, to bypass those and hope that perhaps this time the prophecy won't apply to them. So giving away, sort of abandoning babies and hoping that just giving them away to a shepherd might sort of mean that they'll never have to face the music after all, which is exactly, of course, what Hecuba had done. So Paris was brought up as a shepherd on Mount Ida. So Helen says Hecuba's to blame. Paris should have been killed by Priam, so Priam is equally to blame. If you want to blame someone else, you can blame Paris. He's the one who judged the goddesses, she says. And actually, if you think about it, the one option that Paris chose, so choosing Helen, was the one that was of most benefit to Greece. So effectively, Athena was offering military prowess to the Trojans, and Hera was offering political prowess. So in both of those models, Greece would have been in trouble because, we would have been subject to Asian rule. So actually she's saying by choosing her, yeah, well, fair enough, the Greeks ended up at war, but at least they're not subjugated. At least they can win the war. So there's a way here where she's kind of manipulating this in quite a rhetorically adept way to argue that actually she ought to be thanked by the Greeks because she was the best outcome after all. Menelaus is also to blame. He went off to Crete when Pharos was a guest in his household, again contravening these rules of hospitality. And in any case, how can anyone overcome Aphrodite? You can try and punish Aphrodite if you like, but she's a goddess who is the most powerful of all. So, there's no sense, I think, from this speech that we necessarily have to believe each of these arguments. There's a joy in the sort of the sophistic element of making a weaker argument the stronger, of reveling in the possibilities of using particular argumentative strategies. But there's also kind of a very real question here about why it is that Helen is being the butt of all of everybody's scorn and hatred, when actually causation, as she puts it, is a much wider and trickier issue than that. I think underlying this too is a sort of an age-old fear about the deceptive rhetoric of women. So in the Odyssey, so Agamemnon in particular talks about this, talks about Helen's half-sister Clytemnestra as particularly adept at guileful words, says, well, actually you just have to watch out for women in general as a result of this. Even Penelope, he says to Odysseus, just make sure you watch it because women are always using these sort of tricksy words. So here we have a coming together of the kind of rhetorical techniques of classical Athens and an archaic epic sense that women are simply not to be trusted, that they are scheming and plotting and capable of turning arguments around one another and sort of entrapping you really in a net of words. Now, Hecuba responds quite ferociously, says it's completely implausible that goddesses would have betrayed Greece. These are goddesses associated with Greece, with Argos and with Athens. There's no way that they would have done that. Instead, Helen fell in love with Paris, particularly with his wealth. So Hecuba is very concerned with the idea that Troy is a wealthy city, and Helen's rhetoric is self-serving, that she's blaming Aphrodite. Now, this is what we might think of as the Elpenor argument that we saw in the first week. So Elpenor was the figure whom we met in the underworld of the Odyssey, who got drunk, fell off the roof of Circe's house, and then blamed it on a god. And this was, we saw kind of raised questions for ancient philosophers about the degree to which a lot of people's rhetoric, when they come to the sort of self-exculpation, is quite self-serving. If you can blame what happens to you and your own bad decisions on a god, where does it ever end? And this is a question that's raised too all the way through the Odyssey, partly right from the start where the gods are debating how humans tell their own stories. So it's about sort of the creation of stories and narratives to explain or justify or excuse certain kinds of action. She goes on with a whole series of other kinds of arguments that, there's no proof that Helen was abducted forcibly. Why didn't Castor and Polydeuces rescue her if she was sort of kicking up such a fuss at the time? She says Helen herself is pretty fickle. She sometimes allies herself with the Greeks and sometimes with the Trojans. So she's picking up on things that are said in the Iliad itself here. So she's almost turning Homer against Helen herself. Hecuba would have helped Helen to return to Menelaus, but actually what Helen wanted is particularly this sense of oriental splendour, as she puts it. Again, there's a very 5th century perspective, that kind of interest in the sort of slightly deceptive allure of the East as it was seen at the time. And Helen's love of wealth and finery can be seen even now. And this is something that Euripides makes much of, the idea that Hecuba herself is in rags. She's sort of physically broken. Everybody, apart from Helen, has their hair cropped in mourning, whereas Helen is appearing in ostentatious finery and with sort of a very appealing visual appearance. So Hecuba rebuts Helen's arguments one by one. And I think particularly interesting is this argument that she says that effectively it was Helen who wanted Paris. So when you saw him, your mind was turned into Aphrodite, she says. All acts of foolishness are Aphrodite to mortals, and the name of the goddess rightly begins with folly. The language here is quite difficult to replicate in English, but she's making a sort of a pun. It sounds too trivializing, but an etymological connection between Aphrodite as goddess of desire and Aphrozoune, which is the Greek for foolishness. So she's saying, well, actually, it's just foolishness, and you call it Aphrodite. And I think this is it's a very, very radical claim here. And it's one that Euripides got in trouble in this period for these potentially atheistic claims that many of his characters made. So Hecuba's claim that essentially foolishness is dressed up by all sorts of characters in justifying their own behaviour as the action of gods. And there is a tendency, of course, in ancient Greek culture to externalise emotions, to say, well, I can't be held responsible for my own desire or for my own emotional impulses. It was an external agent who sort of arrived out of the blue and sort of struck me, and I was completely unable to defend myself or to behave any differently. So that's something that we find all the way across things like sort of ancient lyric poetry, tragedy and so on, but it's not one that is unconditionally accepted. And so we see here Hecuba debating the degree to which we can really say that that is a valid excuse or even an explanation for behaviour. So Euripides then is exploring this kind of relationship between rhetoric and justice, particularly the idea that rhetoric is not the same as justice, and it's perfectly possible to give a very convincing speech that is entirely false or self-serving. And I think, of course, this is something that tragedy plays with quite a lot, uses figures like Odysseus, we already glimpsed that, as the great orator, the figure who is very well adept both at lying and at persuading. So that's what rhetoric is, effectively, is persuasion. But there is, I think, a kind of a wider sense in which he is exploring both the power and the limitations of language. This is not uncontroversial in a period where there was, a lot of rhetoric about things like warfare and about political decisions that are being made, including, more or less exactly this time, the Sicilian expedition and so on. But there is, I think, an ultimate irony here in that Helen loses the debate. So she's a very persuasive rhetorician in some ways, but she loses the debate. Menelaus is absolutely dead set that she's going to die, but none of that matters. So Hecuba warns Menelaus, says, whatever you do, don't go back on the boat. Don't go back with her to Sparta. Just have her killed. And we know full well, we've seen it, for instance, in the Odyssey, that Helen does go back with Menelaus, and as he's about to kill her, he relents. Her beauty overcomes him, and he doesn't kill her, and we see them 10 years on in the Odyssey living happily ever after. So there's a question here. So Helen says she doesn't have any agency, doesn't have any ability to control her actions, that everybody else, the gods or Paris or Menelaus, everybody else is to blame. She's got no control over her own life. But actually the ultimate irony of this situation is that she turns out to have more control than anybody else. And it's Hecuba who has sort of all these arguments about Helen's responsibility, who ends up dead and who has all her agency stripped away from her, whereas Helen is saved. I mean, Helen admittedly doesn't have much power to control that. Her beauty has an agency of its own, and she is sort of a victim of that to some degree as well. But we have a kind of an extended trial about Helen's responsibility. She's found guilty, but it makes not a blind bit of difference to the ultimate outcome. So we've seen then a tradition of debating the degree to which Helen can be blamed or exculpated, sort of defended or justified for her actions. And I want to look a little bit more briefly at two other traditions of thinking about Helen and her relationship partly with Paris and partly the decision-making capabilities that she has. Now, we saw last week that Philostratus' On Heroes, that text that has a traveller debate and discuss and kind of explore with the vine tender the truth about the Trojan War. And we hear all about Protesilaus himself and his own life. We heard about Homer having composed the Iliad and the Odyssey as essentially propaganda for Odysseus, the bargain that he struck with the figure of Odysseus to promote him at the expense of all others. One further thing that he says Protesilaus blames Homer for is for sort of really deliberately covering up the fact that Helen was in Egypt for the entire duration of the Trojan War. Now this, of course, Philostratus isn't the first to say this. This was an ancient tradition that we know from the archaic lyric poet Stesichorus, and it's something that's explored too in Euripides' tragedy, Helen. But this is a different way of approaching the question of Helen's responsibility. So she was neither abducted forcibly, so it's neither a question of her lack of agency, nor did she justifiably elope, but she simply wasn't there. So Helen, we find out, is instead in Egypt safely, and the Helen that is seen in Troy is a phantom, an eidolon. And there's a kind of an interesting question here about, where that leaves Helen. So in this case, unlike with Hecuba, we can't blame her. It's not her fault necessarily, but also she's got no agency. She is not in control of her own life. If, she is sort of simply duplicated, as it were, in a copy of her, a phantom form of Helen is left in Troy, there is no way in which she can really be in control. And she is simply something that is implied of her elsewhere, that she is an object for men to fight over, irrespective of her own behaviour. Now, Philostratus has Protesilaus talk about this. He says Homer knew this perfectly well, but he quite deliberately chose not to depict this. Again, one of these sort of Homeric revisionist narratives. So it's not that Homer thought she was there, but it was a deliberate strategy, partly because he wanted to sort of glorify Helen and glorify the war. The Trojan War is the greatest war ever. But what I think is quite interesting is that he is using the contradictions or the ambiguities of the Homeric epics to justify this position. So he says, why is it that she would quite happily stand on the wall of Troy and look at this if she'd caused it? There's no way she could actually do that. She would have been embarrassed. She would have veiled herself. She would have thought it was disgraceful to watch. He says, Hector would never have allowed her not to be returned to Menelaus if she'd actually been there. Priam wouldn't have allowed Paris to do the things that he did when his sons had already died. Helen would have been killed by the Trojan women whose husbands, brothers and children had perished. She might even have deserted to Menelaus because she was so unpopular. So Protesilaus, or Philostratus here, is taking all of those hints that we get all the way through the Iliad, these sort of ambiguities or ambivalences about Helen, and using them to support the argument, the un-Homeric argument that Helen wasn't even there. And this is a strategy that we find also in the Homeric critics and sort of commentators and scholiasts and things like that, who are explaining Homer from Homer. Is the way it's thought about. So you take details from the Homeric epics and you use it to back up your particular argument. So rather than saying Homer simply got it wrong, it's sort of saying, well, I can justify a rational argument based on the details. And this is absolutely something that doesn't make sense in the Homeric epics. Why is it that Helen isn't simply handed back? Why are the Trojans happy to keep her? It's hinted at, but it's never explicitly discussed. And we've seen in the Trojan women, Menelaus says, well, actually, he's not even fighting for Helen, he's fighting for his own honour. He's fighting because Paris has sort of impugned his honour by taking somebody from his own house. And Protesilaus takes this even further by saying, actually the single combat between Menelaus and Paris has to be excised. So again, a sort of a play with those traditions of cutting out sections of the Homeric epics and saying these are not genuine. He says, if we know that Helen wasn't actually there, that wouldn't really have happened because they knew full well. So it is not even that they think she's there, but they knew full well that she's in Egypt and they just don't care. So it's not really about Helen. They're fighting because they want to sack Troy. They fight because they want the wealth of Troy. And that is sort of an interesting kind of revisionist account of the Trojan War, the idea that they're not even fighting for Helen, despite what everybody says. But it's one also that does pick up on sort of genuine elements and debates and hints that we get in the Iliad, where the Greeks do discuss why they're fighting. And very clearly part of their motivation is to win prizes, wealth, women, all these things that signal their own social status. So the degree to which Helen becomes a pretext then, even amongst the Greeks, so she can be blamed, but ultimately that is really a sort of projection, a pretext for their own mercenary aims in fighting this war. So Protesilaus sets the record straight on Helen. So she wasn't actually there. The Greeks even knew this. Homer knew this full well. The Greeks themselves knew this. They used it as an excuse. His final twist is to imagine a world in which Helen and Achilles, who are both privileged by virtue of their connection to Zeus, they end up on, not in the sort of normal underworld, but on Leucer, the White Island in the Black Sea. And there, Protesilaus tells us, he spends a lot of time there with them, at dinner parties with them, so he knows the full story, he says. They fell in love. And so actually, the ultimate irony is that Helen has yet another husband. So after Menelaus and after Paris, after Deiphobus, her final husband is Achilles. And this too, there's a way in which this looks to a kind of parallelism that you get even in the Iliad between Helen and Achilles as sort of these powerful figures. And it looks also to a fragment of the epic poem The Cypria, which talks about the ultimate reason for the Trojan War, which isn't really Helen at all, but is the fact that the world is overpopulated, we hear. So we just simply need to cut through huge swathes of the population and sort of lighten the load on the earth a little. So this is done in two ways. Firstly, by the generation of Achilles. Zeus marries Thetis off to a mortal, Peleus, and Achilles is born. So he's going to be the fighter that just kills huge numbers of people and therefore sorts out the overpopulation problem. And the other solution is Helen. So again, via Zeus and his relationship with Leda. But through Achilles and through Helen, the Trojan War is brought about as a way of really relieving the earth. So in the fragment that we hear that Gaia, the earth personified, is sort of groaning and can't bear the sort of huge numbers of human beings. So Helen and Achilles end up falling in love. And Protesilaus' final detail is that their main hobby on the White Island is composing poetry. So they spend their time dining together and singing songs about one another. They're both quite concerned with their reputation. So this is picking up, obviously, on the interest that both of them have in reputation. You know, that's the reason that Achilles gets into trouble in the Iliad in the first place, is his single-minded obsession with his own reputation. And so too with Helen, who's constantly talking about what people think of her and how she's going to be remembered and how people are talking about her behaviour. So they both spend time singing songs about one another and about Homer and about the Homeric account of Troy. And some of these praise Homer for the way that they've been portrayed in his epics, and some, of course, are sort of tacit corrections to the Homeric narrative. So I rather like that sort of tradition, which you don't hear very much about. We have occasional references to Pausanias, a travel writer in the 2nd century, also talks about this tradition of Helen and Achilles as cult figures on the island of Leuce. So it clearly was a sort of independent ancient tradition that these figures are venerated after their death and become really important in this island. But the idea that this is the kind of the happily ever after love story that we don't get in the Iliad is rather a lovely detail. So we've had then traditions of thinking about Helen's degree of responsibility, of debating this question of how far human beings at large and women in particular can be held responsible for their actions, the degree of freedom that we do actually exercise over our own lives. And we've been thinking about an alternative tradition that cuts through these by saying, you know, Helen simply wasn't there. It was only a phantom of her, and she was really virtuously remaining in Egypt. And I want to finish by thinking about a third alternative that we get in the ancient tradition, which is something that comes out particularly in Colluthus's Abduction of Helen, which is a little known late antique epic, so about the 5th or 6th century AD, a miniature epic, only a few hundred lines long, on Paris's abduction of Helen. So it retells some of the stories that we get in the epic cycle in the Cypria. And it too starts by thinking about this question of causation. So the ultimate question here is, you know, you're thinking about who is to blame for the Trojan War, but how far back do you go? You can blame Helen. We've already seen you can blame Menelaus for causing that war. You know, he could have gone individually to collect her rather than taking an entire army. You can blame Pharos for his abduction. But, you know, if you go back further, you can blame the fact that the very judgment of Pharos was actually occasioned by the goddess Strife, who had been not invited to the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. You're in a bit of a bind. You don't know whether to invite Strife or Discord to your wedding, in which case you're going to have arguments, or you don't invite Discord, at which point she causes arguments anyway because she's annoyed at not being invited. So really it's a sort of catch-22 with Strife, and sort of ancient authors explored that in all sorts of ways. And to go back further, the reason Peleus and Thetis were being married in the first place was Zeus was worried about the child of Thetis being more powerful than their father. So looked at in that respect, causality is a much messier, blurrier web than simply a question of blaming one figure about whether they, you know, actually chose to undertake deliberately immoral or adulterous behaviour. So Colluthus's poem right from the start explored these questions by taking the origin of the narrative back much further. So one question about the Homeric epic, and one reason why it's so focused on Helen, is we never get the full story. We get a snippet, we have a brief reference towards the end of the Iliad to the judgment of Paris, but we never see it played out in narrative form. We focus instead on a series of arguments about women. So right from the start, the argument between Achilles and Agamemnon is about women as a prize of war and a marker of social status. So Agamemnon's war captive Chryseis has been taken away from him. He takes Achilles' war captive Briseis, etc. All of these are replaying in miniature, in effect, the abduction of Helen by Paris. So it's a narrative that focuses particularly on this question of women as war prizes and figures of competition in the fight between men. Colluthus opens differently by setting that in a wider perspective of what is going on, particularly tracing it all the way back to the judgment of Paris and the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. But what particularly interests me is the way in which he totally de-eroticizes the relationship between Paris and Helen. So Paris goes to Sparta to find Helen, having been promised the most beautiful woman in the world, but actually he's a tourist. So before he even gets to Helen, he looks at the land of Thessaly, Phthia, Mycenae, Erymanthus. We get essentially a travel narrative. This is like a sort of a rough guide to Greece for a late antique audience. Looks at Sparta, looks at Therapne. Then he comes to Sparta, but he doesn't seek out Helen straight away. He wanders around Sparta, observes the high-built houses of hospitable. There has a sort of heavy irony. The hospitality of Menelaus, of course, is the one that sort of turned against him in the end, as he welcomed, as Paris made himself comfortable in Menelaus's house. So he looks at the houses and the temples, measured out the beauty of this. The beauty is associated here not with Helen, but with Sparta at large. And there is, I think, a kind of a fascination with that sense of recapturing the beauty of Sparta as it would have been in the archaic or even the classical period. A lot of this is mediated through ancient guidebooks. So things like Pausanias' account of the cults that you get in Sparta. So there is, last week we talked about that sort of fantasy of bridging the divide between past and present, the idea that Protesilaus can come back to life and tell you what really happened. Here we have a sort of a similar fantasy that you can wander around Sparta when it was in its heyday. So he admires the golden icon of native Athena, the treasure of Carnean Apollo. So this is here the cult of Hyacinthus in Amyclae, just outside Sparta. And we get the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus. So it takes ages before we even get to Helen, and Paris is in absolutely no hurry. So he wanders through Sparta. So here we have a kind of an interest in the idea of Paris's own motivations for meeting Helen. Then when he finally does meet her, we hear absolutely nothing of Helen's beauty. So he comes into the house, he's described as attractive, but actually how he seduces her is to say, well, have you ever heard of Troy? Poseidon and Apollo built the walls. I'm part of that wealthy lineage. And actually to serve this king, he was so powerful that the gods came and built the walls of our fatherland, these indestructible walls. Let's get married. Which is a very abrupt, I mean, I've cut out a couple of lines, but there's really nothing in those lines that is seductive and persuasive and represents that sort of eroticized encounter. He is saying, Troy is magnificent, you should see the walls. And that to me is a sort of extraordinary moment. And there's been kind of, it's met with a little bit of critical hostility. Some people say, well, this is completely implausible. What is going on here? Is this just a bad poet? But I think actually there's a kind of a much bigger story at work here, which is the kind of motivations for movement and for travel. And particularly this is a period of intense mobility around the kind of expanding sort of Greek world that is turning into the Byzantine Empire in this period. And Helen kind of responds to this sense that Troy, that Asia Minor is a place that's worth seeing, by saying, is it actually true that Poseidon and Apollo laid the foundations of your fatherland? I really want to go and see it. Come, take me from Sparta to Troy, let's get married. So she responds to Paris's, sort of tourism propaganda, really, by saying, okay, great, I've always wanted to see Troy, let's do it. Which, again, I think gives us a hint of other ways of understanding the question of mobility and travel. And this, I think, is particularly bound up with the foundation, especially of Byzantium, to become Constantinople, as a sort of a new imperial capital and something that's drawing people in from across the empire. And Byzantium was being represented as a new Rome and itself a new Troy as well. So I think there's a kind of a real sense in this period that Troy itself, the idea of that kind of connection to the history, the idea that people would migrate to the imperial court where the centre of wealth and power and sort of splendour and architectural interest were really located. So Paris and Helen are here rewritten as tourists and as figures who are kind of drawn really to the impressive architectural features of the cities they encounter, whether that's Sparta or Troy. And there's a kind of deliberate mirroring of the beauties of Sparta and the beauties of Troy. And I think in a way you can read this as Colluthus solving the question of how Helen can be exonerated without stripping her of agency. So we have here a Helen who does make her own decisions, but it's not motivated by lust and the desire for adultery. So she is making a sort of a rational, conscious decision. She's not simply a bad person or a phantom, but it is, I think, there's a question here, perhaps this is being sanitized for a Christian audience. That's one possibility. We're dealing here with an era where sort of pagan narratives were being rewritten for Christian audiences. But there's also a way in which this is a kind of a genuine interest in other ways of understanding motivation. If we've seen that Helen all the way through the ancient tradition becomes a catalyst for these questions about why people make the decisions that they do and who is responsible, whether they are individually responsible, whether they are fated, or whether there are all kinds of decisions that are being made that are justified in one way to one person and another to another. Colluthus gives us an altogether different set of motivations for that relationship between Paris and Helen. So we've seen then that there are different ways of thinking about Helen's relationship with Paris and that question of responsibility. We've seen versions where the rhetoric of legal trials, of defence and prosecution come to the fore. The question of causation that has by this stage a very strong both legal and rhetorical framework. And that's something that really puts a lot of focus on agency and decision-making capability, but also runs the risk of bringing not just Helen, but kind of all women into disrepute by saying that, fundamentally Helen and many other women too cannot be trusted. There's another tradition where Helen is said to be replaced by a phantom, where she remains virtuous but is stripped of all ability to make decisions and to be a real person in some sense. And we have an alternative tradition that Colluthus is presenting us with, where we have a new sense of agency that's motivated by altogether different set of concerns. Thank you.